Hi, I'm Benjamin Altschuler, and over the past 18 months, I've been fortunate enough to interview some of the luminaries in the field of classics as part of the Classics Conclave American Philological Association Oral History Project. This project has taken me from Milwaukee to Oxford and many places in between. Among others, I have interviewed Nigel Wilson of Lincoln College, Oxford, Miriam Griffin of Somerville College, Oxford, Jasper Griffin of Balliol College, Oxford, Sir John Boardman of Lincoln College, Oxford, Mary Lufkowitz of Wellesley College, Roger Bagnall of New York University and Columbia, Elaine Phantom of Princeton, David Ross of the University of Michigan, Ramsey McMullen of Yale, John F. Matthews of Yale, Peter R.L. Brown of Princeton, Robert A. Castor of Princeton, Susan M. Tregeri of Stanford. I hope you enjoy the following excerpts from our many interviews. What do you believe are the characteristics of a good classics student?
I think one's got to have an understanding of the differences of individuals' characters. I think that's probably the most important thing. And reading literature in other languages, of course, does alert one to different mental makeups. And somebody once said, I think, that learning a new language allows you to acquire a new soul, or words to that effect. So if you can see and appreciate the differences of outlook which are reflected in the classical texts, then you're gaining something, and that's what will bring you success, I would say.
It's a very funny business. That is, teaching is not straightforward because people are not all the same. And when you start teaching, you think everybody will be like me, except for the stupid ones at the back of the class. But actually they're not. Even clever ones are not like you, they're quite different. However, everybody can learn it.
I think people learn it with different skills. That is, sometimes people learn it as if it were a form of mathematics. And sometimes people who really can't do mathematics at all are just good at languages. So it's a combination of skills. And some people have more of one side than they have of another, I think. But of course, the Romans learned it the way we learn our native language. I mean, they didn't learn it as a system. They just picked it up as they went along because they had to communicate. I mean, we tend to learn it as a system. But since Latin is very systematic, I think students of a certain intelligence like it because they can dominate it. That is, you can predict it. You can get hold of the system and then you can guess what the next form will be like. And for an intelligent student, that's interesting. It's not just rote learning, where you have to learn every single form separately. And I think that's what a teacher should appeal to, actually. The fact that you can actually get control of it.
How do you describe the experience of actually interacting, feeling, and looking at a Greek pot, as opposed to seeing pictures of it on a slide?
It's very important to deal with the real thing. And this is a big problem, I think, with modern education. You slick a thing up on the screen and you think you know it. Take a Xerox of it and put it in your file and you think you know it. You don't. In my day, of course, there weren't any of these things. So one made notes by drawing. And one learned, anybody can draw, everybody can draw. With a bit of practice, you get the drawing going. And that is the important aid memoir, which you take from the original object, or if necessary, even from a photograph. But this way of shrinking away from the object and thinking, oh, well, it's all online, I can find it all there, I think destroys development of a very important sense of learning how to look at things, which is vital to the whole thing. You've got to learn how to look at an object, what to look for, how to understand it, turn it around, get it one way or another. There are some people who can't do it. I even know one or two classical archaeologists who can't do it, which is rather sad. But they can't see what they're looking at, can't understand what they're looking at. And that, I think, is terribly important. And either you can do it, or you need people to guide you, to help you see how to do it, which you don't get if you slip it up on a screen or look at it in a photograph. Towards the end of the last century, theory began to creep in. And it was usually promoted by prehistorians because it's easier to practice theory in prehistory because you've never proved that you're wrong. But then when you try to practice it in the historical period, you very often find, yeah, it is wrong, that doesn't work that way. And there's, I'm afraid it's caught up, like archaeology and many other subjects, in the adherence to a theory of some sort, which has changed every 10 years, so that the ology of today is not going to be the one of 15 years' time. People are going to be looking at something else, or thinking they're looking at something else. And the main danger, it doesn't really hurt, because if it asks questions, you need to look for the answers. But it does distract you from the primary evidence. And I find quite a number of books there where the writers obviously don't know the primary evidence. They've never learnt about it and looked at it. But they're really committed to try to create a solution or picture about what happened in antiquity, which is not based on the hard evidence that we've got. And it is hard work. I mean, you need the hard work to do that properly, but not everybody does it.
If you could live in any period in antiquity, when would it be?
I'm not sure I'd ever want to live in a period of antiquity since I'm a woman. I think the only time for a woman to be living is fairly recently, because the lives of women before modern times are pretty dismal and pretty short. And what's liberated us has been to be able to take some control over our own bodies. So I think I wouldn't want, as a woman, to be living in antiquity. As a man, I don't know. I think possibly, well, I've been very tough in any time. Maybe the Hadrianic period, because that seemed to be a period of peace when there was less piracy and there was so much building and construction, and you felt that it was, as Gibbon put it, the happiest age of mankind, perhaps. But 5th century Athens, probably no thanks. War, constant war, pretty much true for Rome as well. And war is not on the level of mass destruction that we've managed to achieve, but still pretty awful.
If heaven exists, what would you like God to say to you at the pearly gates?
Well, there wouldn't be any pearly gates in Greek theology. You know, you'd be lucky if you just sat as a shade in Hades, the river Styx. Well, I don't think anybody would say much. I take the point of view that Socrates takes, that, you know, if it would be great to go back and talk to some Greek authors and say, did I get this right? You know, have I really blown it? Pindar, did you really have a chorus sing your odes, or were they solos? You know, that would have been great to find out. I would like to believe that my husband could go and talk to Sophocles and say, did I get that emendation right? But my own view is that Socrates' other scenario, which is like death being a sleep from which you don't awake, is the true one.
How do you think computer technology has aided your study of ancient papyri? Has it helped or perhaps hurt your work?
Oh, computers have transformed papyrology for the better. I would say in two really obvious, simple ways, probably gradually moving in more complicated, interesting ones. But the one is that you're able to search the texts. And so you get a little fragment that once upon a time you would have ignored because it was too much work. Today you can just search a few scraps of text and you see immediately what it is and what's been lost. And that enables you to do all sorts of things you couldn't have done. You can also get lots of data and organize it in various ways and so on. Just do lots of studies that would have been impossible. The other is digital images. And the availability of digital images has moved papyrology away from being a purely text-oriented field to being more object-oriented, thinking of the papyrus as an artifact. That's been a really interesting transformation, far from complete at this point, but very interesting, causing people to be much more conscious of the embeddedness of the ancient text in ancient society. How did people use these things? That's been a fascinating transformation. It's still in the midst of going on. The older generation has only partly bought into this, but when I see the younger people that work on it, it's just really extraordinary.
But you know, my textbooks at school were intended for boys, because they all were then. We're talking 1940s. And I mean, the pronoun was he, and the interest was military, obviously. And I used to get rather fretful about this. I thought, you know, we're good enough to study this. How come nobody ever notices we're there? And recent textbooks have changed radically in that respect. They're much more inclusive. The very first time I got the idea that the classical world must have been rather marvelous was when I saw an advertisement for Sanatogen tonic wine. And this advertisement showed a godlike young man with a handsome, nice-looking young woman in a chariot. He had his arm round her, with one arm round her, and the other arm was holding the reins. And they were driving past the Acropolis. Now, this doesn't correspond to anything that I believe ever happened in Athenian history, but it certainly caught my imagination. And obviously, I mean, it was partly because it was inclusive, because this young woman was allowed to be in the chariot.
Do you have a favorite Latin or Greek word?
Cato says in the Agricultura, quid dicam de utilitate stercorandi? What could I possibly say about the usefulness of spreading dung? And I think that not only applies to agriculture, but I think that sort of applies to teaching too. So I'd have to say stercorare and sterkos are wonderful words.
In reading Latin or Greek, how important is it to bring the lessons from the past and to apply older understandings to everyday life today?
I think what it does is take you out of your world, which is a very good thing. All of our education now has to be relevant. What we expect kids to read in schools has to be relevant to their limited experience. But this is just so short-sighted. The interesting thing about reading any literature of the past is that you have to go to them. And the past can just be a couple of decades ago, but you have to go to them. And this opens you up. You probably can't take much from it, I don't think, but it certainly opens you up, and I think that's the important thing.
If you were to spend a day at some time in history, perhaps meet someone or do something, when would you like to be transported back to?
I wrote a book about a Roman historian of the 4th century, Ammianus Marcellinus, and he really is a sensationally good writer, wonderfully good. Only half the work survives. One of the great historians, disconcerting, pagan writing about Christians, in a Greek writing in Latin, very elaborate, difficult, but excellent, arresting Latin. And at the end of my book, I say, well, look, we don't know much about this guy. We don't even know if he was tall or short, fat or thin, married or not. Hardly if he could ride a horse. There's some things about him. I'd love just to see him, to see how tall he was. And then to find out, I finished this book with a sense that there are some questions that he's not giving the answer to, but he knows what they are. What do you really think about this? When you wrote that, what did you really mean? Were you being sarcastic in that passage? You know, I would have loved to talk to Ammianus Marcellinus. What you can get from a course of Roman history is an understanding of how people who seem to be the same are actually different, or how people who seem different may have common ground. And this is a very important life skill, to be able to deal with people that you think you understand but turn out not to. So study this with imagination, realizing these may look like us, but they're not like us. And how similar are they, how dissimilar is an education itself.
If you could go back in time and spend a day in ancient history, where would you like to go back to?
Well, I think I would go to a person. I would want to have dinner once a week with Cicero. That would be a stirring time with the very best of company. He was terribly funny, He was a wonderful anecdotalist, and I suspect, I feel sure, in a private setting, he was quite merciless in talking about other people and reducing everyone to roars of laughter because of the rightness of his humor and his vast experience of the realities of high life.
What do you think you gain from reading the sources in their language they were written rather than a translation?
I have always found that unless you read the original, you don't get the rhythm of a thought. You don't really get the rhythm. And I think this is particularly true in both Greek and Latin, because they're both very rhetorical languages. People write so as to persuade. They don't write to record. They really write so as to persuade. And to read something like Augustine's City of God, or Augustine's Confessions, particularly the City of God, which are in the Ciceronian manner. Each book is a great long speech, such as Cicero himself would have been proud to have delivered. Augustine's doing it in his study, Cicero's doing it in the Roman Senate, but they're both doing the same thing. And unless you get the rhythm of persuasion, you lose something. You can tell anyone what the guy thought, but how he came to think it and how he tried to make you think it. That's the other thing which I think is absolutely crucial is the weight of words. This again is for a historian. You can't. I found this when I learned Hebrew particularly, that certain basic concepts are just in the words. And no matter how accurate the translation may be, you don't get the weight. You don't get the weight.
If there is a heaven, what would you like God to say to you at the pearly gates?
Here's the key to my library. Honest to God, I sometimes joke about when in class, joke about being able to borrow a book from God's library. That I would really like to have, one of the texts that we've lost, the rest of Livy, for example, or any whole work of Varro. I'm a bookish sort of person, and that would be my idea of heaven.
If there's a person you could go back and meet for a day, who would it be, and what would you like to talk to them about?
Horace. I think he'd be fun.
What would you talk to him about? Anything, or is there?
Oh, life, the Civil War, Philippi, his friendships, what he really thought about people like Plancus, where he was sitting or standing when he wrote about Soracte being covered in snow. You can see it from so many viewpoints, and people speculate about where he was having his party. I would love to know where exactly he was.
Do you have a favorite Latin word?
I think desiderium is a very good word, and that would be quite hard to translate. It sounds good. It actually fits, I think, the sort of lingering quality. Quis desiderio sit pudor ad modus tam cari capitis, that sort of thing. It fits the feeling. It's much better than desire, which sounds a bit predatory, I think. Desire, longing, affection, missing something. Yes, we haven't got it in English.